talk to us about the impact as far as we believe. Apple has said these potential $200 billion in tariffs will raise the price of Apple Watches, will raise the price of AirPods, but it's that step further, that $267 billion in potential tariffs that could impact the iPhone.
That's exactly right. With this potential $200 billion worth of tariffs, that would impact Apple's smaller business lines like its Apple Watch, AirPods, some other less important product lines. And some analysts have said that that would have a less than 1% impact on profitability in fiscal 2019. But the bigger concern here is as trade tensions escalate, China could impose more onerous red tape and regulatory burdens on Apple's business in China. Now, Tim Cook, since he became CEO, has really made his mark by establishing Apple in China and increasing its market share in the country. So any potential risk to that part of the business could hit Apple's bottom line, especially if these tariffs continue to escalate and tensions continue to rise.
I also want to bring in Isaac Stone Fish, Senior Fellow at the Asia Society, joining us now from Warsaw. Isaac, of course, Apple is really exposed because not only do they manufacture their products in China, they sell a lot of products in China. China is the second biggest market for Apple aside from the United States. What do you see as the biggest risks here?
I think that's a really good point in terms of jumping into the question of biggest risk, because the biggest risk for Apple is certainly not that it decides to raise prices because it's paying more for supplies or because its supply chain becomes more inefficient. Rather, the biggest risk is that the Chinese government decides to make life more difficult for Apple in China and crack down on all sorts of alleged and sometimes made up tax evasion issues or issues of illegally putting apps, like they said recently, illegally putting apps that encourage gambling in China, and all these sort of fake seeming charges that make it harder for Apple to really flourish and succeed in the mainland.
Meantime, Apple has written a letter to the U.S. Trade Representative talking about how this will lead to attacks on consumers. You know, David, I've spoken with Tim Cook about his dialogue with President Trump. It sounds like they have talked a few times. Tim Cook has been to the White House. You wonder if this protest, this resistance from Apple will have any impact on the president's moves going forward or not.
Well, when it comes to this president, I don't think arguments generally have that much of an impact. He kind of does what he does. But I think two things. One, I think to the degree that any tariffs might affect prices of Apple products, consumers are generally insensitive enough to the relatively small price effect that would have. I don't think it would affect demand that dramatically. It could conceivably affect profits if they decide not to raise prices, but honestly, I'm not worried about that. I think Isaac is totally right. The big issue is what happens in China. But I think it's also, and Isaac knows a lot more about China than I do. He's a friend of mine. But I would suspect that it's, I mean, tell me if this is right, Isaac, but I think Apple is by far the most popular non-Chinese brand in China. So the government there has to tread a little bit carefully before it starts coming down too hard on such a kind of people's choice, so to speak.
I think that's right, David.
Isaac, would you agree?
I would. I think Beijing is and will continue to walk a line between ginning up popular anti-American, popular nationalistic sentiments against American brands that are very popular in China, like Starbucks, like Apple, like Google even, which does have a very small presence in terms of people hopping over the Great Firewall to get in and search there. So I think what Beijing is doing right now is really trying to paint any alleged Apple misdeeds as just very strict, going against anti-gambling issues, some issues about quality, really trying to focus, really trying to make a case for what Apple is doing wrong, as opposed to arguing that, people should maybe consider buying a Huawei phone or a Xiaomi phone out of patriotism. We haven't yet seen the government really push and make that argument. However, it is certainly possible that if trade tensions continue to worsen, they will invent reasons why Chinese consumers should not buy Apple products, and that could be a much more serious hit to Apple's bottom line.